I'm here with Dr. Haas, who's the president of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. Dr. Haas, you were just on a panel discussing the U.S.-Israel relationship. What's your forecast for the ties between Israel and the U.S.?
There was a sense that the relationship, while essentially strong for all the well-known reasons, is going to be tested over the next year or two, in some part because of the events going on in the Arab world and how to respond to them and try to in some ways influence them, even more by the Iran issue. I think there was something of a consensus that the Iran issue would be front and center, and the United States and Israel don't necessarily see eye to eye on every detail, and that could be an obvious source of, of friction or even, stress.
Is there worry in the United States among the pro-Israel community that Israel may be turned into a partisan issue with the elections coming up?
I assume there's that possibility, but I think it's unlikely. Right now, the electorate in the United States is overwhelmingly focused on things economic and things domestic. And the only way I would think that Israel would become part of the electoral mix in the run-up to November would be, quite honestly, if there were a crisis with Iran and Israel were part of it. But other than that, I really don't see foreign policy playing all that central a role in the election.
There's been a lot of talk in the media about a divergence in policy between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration on the issue of Iran. Are the two countries on the same page?
I don't have, I'm not privy to the details of their conversations, but I would have thought the president's speech at AIPAC went a long ways towards the Israeli position, where he made it clear that the goal of U.S. policy is not to contain a nuclear Iran, but to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear in the first place. That said, there are some obvious differences over the details, say, of a negotiation and what would be an acceptable agreement. And the Israeli government has articulated certain positions that the United States may not agree are fully necessary. So I'd be surprised if there weren't some frictions on the issue. The mark of a good relationship is never the absence of disagreements. It's how well you manage them. It's your ability to bridge them.
Why have we seen a lack of focus on the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, in your opinion?
Largely probably two reasons. One is there's so much else going on in this part of the world. We were just talking about Iran. Look at what's going on in the streets of Cairo. Look at the massacres going on in Syria. Look what did go on in Libya or Yemen or Bahrain. So the centerpiece of the Arab world is either the Iran issue or what's going on with the various upheavals. On top of that, there also may be a degree of fatigue with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's been around in a familiar way now for more than 4 decades. There's a lot of frustration. There's not a whole lot of optimism. One sees also the splits in the leadership on the Palestinian side. Many years ago, I wrote a book about ripeness. It doesn't look as though the ingredients of a diplomatic breakthrough are there, to say the least. So it's not surprising to me that people are turning to other issues.
Briefly on the issue of Syria, over 13,000 are projected dead there by the UN. At what point will the United States feel compelled to either intervene or to support the rebel forces there?
Well, there's lots of ways to intervene. There's to intervene militarily, as you were suggesting. There's to arm the opposition, who, by the way, are getting arms. But there's lots of other forms of intervention that we haven't yet done. I think there are things the United States and the world can and should do. We could increase the severity of the economic sanctions. Why don't we treat Syria at least as tough as we're treating Iran? We can cut off all civilian air flights. We can really isolate the country. Why don't we tell every single person close to Assad that if he doesn't break ranks, he's going to be indicted for war crimes? Why don't we get the Arab governments to all break relations with Moscow, so long as Russia is a stalwart supporter of the Assad regime? My point is that we ought to intervene, but we should not equate intervention with necessarily using arms or selling arms.
Do you think that those other types of intervention will actually be effective, or might we see a military intervention by some international body at some point?
Again, I doubt we're going to see a full-fledged intervention for any time soon. It's awfully difficult to design one that you can have any confidence will necessarily work, what the outcome would be. It would also be anything but easy, given the capacities of the Syrian armed forces and their irregulars that are supportive of the president. But again, it's premature. It's not premature to respond. It's not premature to intervene, but we haven't yet used anything like the full set of instruments we have available, and that would be my initial recommendation. Let's really economically make this regime pay a price and get the supporters of the regime to think twice or maybe a third time about the cost of the continuity of the Assad regime. And I think if we do that, and also if the opposition if we work with them so they spell out an attractive alternative. Essentially, I want the Alawites in Syria to feel that their future is not the same, say, as the Sunnis in Iraq after Saddam. We want them to believe that they have a legitimate and safe future in some alternative Syria. And I think if we begin to move in that direction, there's a chance that non-military intervention could actually work.
Finally, how will the U.S. cope with the rising tide of Islamist governments in the Middle East?
Well, it's a reality. Even more, you have the rising tide of Arab political participation. I think in many countries, the era where we could simply deal with monarchs or presidents is over. We're going to have to learn how to deal with popularly elected politicians. We're not going to like a lot of what they're going to say and do. So I think our relations ought to be very pragmatic and conditional. Essentially, we will act favorably towards you if you do A, B, and C, or if you don't do A, B, and C. We spell it out, and we let them know that there would be repercussions if they said and did things that we believe were inconsistent with our interests and values. So it's going to become a much more complicated, much more conditional set of relations.
Dr. Haas, thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed the conference.
Thanks very much.